All right, so I think we'll like to get started because we have a lot to cover today. Good afternoon and to everyone, and welcome to the ABA Commission on Immigration's panel, The Lifeguard is Drowning, Identifying and Combating Burnout and Secondary Trauma in Asylum Practitioners. I'm Dina Sharouk. I'm a senior legal advisor at the Commission on Immigration, and I'll be moderating today's talk. Um, for just some housekeeping matters. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A and we will save them for the end to address them. With that, I'd like to introduce the fabulous experts that we have on our panel today. Eloy Gardea is a senior attorney at the ABA Commission on Immigration. Prior to joining the ABA, Eloy was a senior staff attorney at the Refugee and Immigrant Center for Education and Legal Services, also known as RAICES. And while at RAICES, Eloy's work included removal defense for both detained and non-detained individuals, as well as helping attending immigrants with family petitions, humanitarian visa applications, and citizenship applications. Previously, Eloy worked as a staff attorney at Catholic Charities St. Francis Cabrini Center for Immigrant and Legal Services in Houston, where he represented various populations facing removal from the US, including unaccompanied minors and victims of gender-based violence. He received his JD from Columbia Law School in 2013. Professor Lindsay M. Harris directs UDC Law's the Immigration and Human Rights Clinic. In 2020, Ayla awarded her with the Elmer Freed Excellence in Teaching Award. She serves as Associate Dean of Clinical and Experiential Programs and is on the AILA National Asylum Committee. Previously, Professor Harris worked at the American Immigration Council, and the work focused on efforts to end family detention. And she also worked at the Tahirih Justice Center as an Equal Justice Works Fellow and staff attorney leading the African Women's Empowerment Project. She clerked on the Ninth Circuit and previously taught at Georgetown Law and George Mason. She led the 2020 National Asylum Attorney Burnout and Secondary Survey and wrote up her findings with her co-author, Hilary Mellinger, who we'll introduce shortly. Leora Hudak is a licensed clinical social worker at the program and the program manager for migration partnerships at the Center for Victims of Torture. And in this role, Leora oversees all the Center for Victims of Torture's programming at the US-Mexico border and in Latin America. Leora also leads secondary trauma and resilience programming for frontline workers at CVT. Leora designed and led CVT's secondary trauma and resilience training for immigration lawyers working at the US-Mexico border. And that's an 8-week in-depth training and peer support opportunity that was tailored to the realities of working in asylum law. To date, the training has reached more than 150 legal service providers in the Borderlands region. Leora is passionate about working at the intersections of mental health and immigration, and she's worked closely with lawyers in support of client cases. And she provides psychological evaluations and testimony in a variety of immigration cases. She's based in Denver, Colorado. And finally, Hilary Mellinger is an assistant professor of criminal justice and criminology at Washington State University. Her research focuses on asylum policy, the criminalization of migration, the immigration legal profession, and interpretation challenges within the criminal justice system and immigration system. Prior to earning her PhD, Dr. Mellinger worked as a Board of Immigration's Appeals accredited representative at the Tahirih Justice Center, which is a national nonprofit organization that supports immigrant women and girls fleeing gender-based violence through a combination of legal representation, social services, and public policy. So welcome, we're so glad to have you all. And as you can see, this is a terrific group of experts. So let's not dilly-dally too much. Let's hop into some of the questions on this very important topic. Maybe a good idea would be to start off with understanding the terms that we're discussing here, and perhaps we could define what burnout and secondary trauma are.
Yeah, thank you for that. And hi, everyone. I'm glad to see so many folks connected to this webinar. That's really encouraging from our perspective. And so just to say a little bit, to kind of give a definition of each one of these terms, burnout, important thing to know about burnout is this is something that impacts people in all professions. So it's not specific to folks who are working with asylum seekers or confronting trauma in their work, but burnout is considered a syndrome that results from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. So there's usually a few different dimensions that are noted when we talk about burnout. So feeling energy depletion or exhaustion, having a feeling of sort of being negative or cynical about one's work, and having reduced efficacy in your work or feeling like you're less effective in the work that you're doing. So sometimes people talk about burnout as feeling like you've lost your work-life balance, lost the meaning behind your work, having a lack of compensation, feeling unrecognized or like there's no gratification for what you're doing, or feeling overloaded or worn out, right? So those are some of the ways that we talk about burnout. Secondary traumatic stress is a little bit different because it often results from bearing witness to trauma or being exposed to the trauma of others. So specifically, this refers to hearing or knowing about traumatizing events experienced by another person. So some authors talk about secondary traumatic stress as being really kind of increased by the need in oneself to help somebody who's traumatized or suffering, and feeling like you don't have the ability to help in the way that you might. So I think it's important to note too that, from my background, secondary traumatic stress has been in the last several years starting to be recognized. Even within the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, as being recognized as something that's can be a very real and chronic condition after being exposed to some suffering or trauma of others. The one thing I really want to highlight about why we start here is that it's important to differentiate these terms. A lot of times what we hear is this type of terminology being used interchangeably. So everything is just characterized by burnout, right? Like everybody in my workplace is burned out. That's the problem that we have. And there's actually a lot of different terms within the field of employee well-being that can describe different types and nuanced types of experiences like burnout, secondary trauma, compassion fatigue, moral distress, right? We have all sorts of different terminology. And one of the most important first steps to being able to address secondary trauma and burnout, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is to know what you're dealing with. So being able to have a response that we know that this is the type of plan that works when there's chronic burnout in the workplace. There's something a little bit different that's needed when we're talking about secondary trauma. So I just want to keep that in mind as we get started. That's why we clearly define some of these different terms that exist in the field, because it will help to point us to where we're going when it comes to defining what the response is.
Just wanted to hop in there and add a couple of things that I think, as someone who doesn't have the professional background that Leora does, but as someone who's studied this and thinks about this a lot, one of the things I think that's really interesting about secondary trauma, two things actually. One is my understanding is that secondary trauma is a cumulative response to trauma exposure, right? That it builds up over time, and that your level of trauma exposure over a period of time affects, whether or not this is going to manifest for you. And then the second thing I would say is that the studies really show that an awareness and an understanding of secondary trauma can actually help to prevent symptoms ever developing, right? Or can help manage or mitigate symptoms if they already have. So to me, sessions like this, and actually signing up, and for all those of you, the 300 people in the audience right now, this is a part of preventing secondary trauma, engaging and thinking and learning and reading about these topics. And I think it's something that I've argued in other contexts that we really owe to our clients to manage our own trauma exposure. So I just wanted to add that in, and also to thank you, Dina, and to the ABA folks for hosting this. This is like a really wonderful turnout and such an important topic, I think. So really heartened to see everybody interested in thinking about this.
That's really, those are both, I'm very grateful to those definitions. And also it's so important to note that fact that awareness really can contribute to managing some of this mental health crisis. And perhaps we'll talk more shortly about other things we can do to mitigate this crisis. I wonder what populations, I know there's an understanding here that asylum attorneys are certainly facing struggling with burnout and secondary trauma, what are the populations that we see similarly that are going through this mental health crisis?
Yeah, I think this is one of the things I think is really important to highlight, is that this is something we all deal with. And one of the messages that we give when we talk about this externally from my work is that to do this work is to be impacted. And it doesn't mean that that's all negative, and it also doesn't mean that it's pathological. So, you know, there's a lot of different ways that we're impacted by this work. We haven't even touched on secondary resilience or vicarious resilience as a component of that, right? So to be engaged in this work, to be engaged with communities who, and to be in support of or in solidarity of communities that are struggling, means to be impacted by that. And that's something that we should normalize and embrace. So I think anybody who's doing this sort of work where there's exposure to the trauma or suffering of others should expect that there will be impacts from that. That doesn't mean that you've developed a mental health condition or a diagnosable psychological condition. That doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. It means that we're all managing and processing the things that we're experiencing, we're witnessing in the ways that we're walking alongside others. So, you know, this is something that I personally, although I'm the person who, you know, provides the webinars, the support and the training around this topic, it doesn't mean I've mastered it. It means that I've learned some of the skills Lindsay has described to mitigate, to recognize, acknowledge, and respond to the effects of the work, but certainly it impacts all of us in different ways at different times in our lives.
Well, that's such an interesting lens. I had not thought of the concept of kind of a secondary resilience as a process. Do we think that there's something specific to immigration attorneys or those of us working in asylum, specifically here, how it impacts these phenomena, the secondary trauma and burnout, how they impact this side of the profession?
I'll just jump in there and say that, you know, some of this has sprung from the article that Hillary and I have written on the study that I launched in 2020, and that did focus specifically on asylum attorneys, right, as a subset of immigration attorneys. So just want to recognize that people doing immigration work, and I refer to not just attorneys, everybody doing this work, right, from the social workers to the receptionists at the front desk, the accredited representatives, the staff assistants, the paralegals, everybody touching on asylum, on immigration far more broadly, is potentially impacted by this work. As Leora said, if you're doing this work, struggling alongside communities who are indeed facing their own struggles, then you're a human being, then you're going to feel these effects, right? That's normal, that's natural, and we need to normalize that. And this panel, the ABA, holding a panel like this is a piece of that. So just wanted to say it's not just asylum attorneys, it's immigration attorneys more broadly, and it's not even just immigration attorneys, right? It's people working alongside other people who struggle. But I do think that this study that we did was a first step and looking at one specific population, and I certainly have reasons for focusing on that specific population, but it's not to exclude anybody else.
You know, some of the things that we have found in talking with asylum practitioners that I think have been really salient have been, well, let's say there are some particularities of the role of being an asylum attorney that have come along with some vulnerabilities to be exposed to secondary trauma. That, for example, is the need to gather an extremely detailed and accurate story as a part of the asylum application and affidavit. And so that means often going into over and over again some of the details of the trauma with your clients. And so there's a level of detailed exposure that's necessary to be successful in the role that I think is really unique. A lot of the folks that we work with also point, you know, to a little bit to the culture of the legal profession, so that, you know, if coming from that background of law school, billable hours, all of those things that are built in to what it means to be a lawyer, that when we kind of separate out asylum law and the level of exposure to trauma, some of the culture around how law is practiced doesn't feel like it fits well, right? Like the more hours you work, the better, the higher volume of a caseload, all of those things can be contributing factors from this like bigger culture of the legal environment. And I would say, you know, another thing about this is often a lot of our asylum practitioners are also working within pretty resource restricted legal services organizations or working on a pro bono basis in addition to their other workload, right? So that means that there's all of these other institutional constraints that can sometimes prevent folks from being able to represent their cases in the way that they think is best. Because they're applying for grants. So really to contextualize this, not just as something that's an individual issue that points to any sort of weakness in somebody who's practicing asylum law, but there's all sorts of different structural elements and cultural elements that contribute to some of this as well. So I think that's important to kind of think about what is the environment in which an asylum practitioner works.
If I may add, I think the title of today's panel actually speaks to kind of the context in which asylum attorneys and immigration attorneys find themselves in, and that is a lifeguard who is drowning. You know, I think that term is problematic for two reasons. One, we create this savior narrative, right, that people need saving, and two, you're creating a situation whereby you are making an expectation out of the profession. And for people who are entering this profession, who might have a deep obligation or a sense of obligation to help, you're creating this situation where they may never be able to meet that expectation. And if they never meet that expectation, you know, what's going to be the likely outcome? You know, and that might be burnout. So I think that's important to note. And I'm glad that we're having these kind of discussions. I'm grateful to Lindsay and to Hillary for starting these steps and analyzing kind of what's going on, because I think as practitioners, we can craft and cultivate the type of aim we want our profession to go, and it's specific for asylum attorneys and immigration attorneys. So thanks for that.
Thank you. That's so helpful. I think that contribution regarding the systemic elements of our profession, and that broadly applies to practitioners, you know, lawyers, law students, accredited representatives, social workers, et cetera. And I think that's such an important topic that I hope we'll come back to, including the narratives that surround us as practitioners. I wonder, before we hop into more of the macro level, if we can talk a little bit about, on the ground, what that impact of secondary trauma and burnout might be on the clients that we serve. Because certainly if practitioners are impacted, one can only imagine how our clients could be. And perhaps
I can start us off, but I'd be curious to hear what Lindsay and Hillary have found in this question too. I think this is a careful question to answer, because we don't want to send the message that to experience burnout or secondary trauma somehow means that is necessarily going to correlate with a negative impact on the client population. There are lots of folks who can struggle with this and deal with this and continue to do their work in a ethical and competent way at the same time. So I'm going to kind of start with that reflection, but to say over time, some of the impact that we can see that can affect the client work is that it really can, you know, folks feel like they're in a position where they're compromising their values or ethics. It can lead to a more difficult process in ethical decision making. It can cloud some of our judgment if it's something that's not dealt with over time. A lot of times folks feel like they are less effective in the work that they're doing, or they feel like they're making really complicated decisions where they're making the impossible choice between how to support one case over another, because we talked about those big caseloads, the lack of resources. But I think one of the more important things to note is that when this isn't dealt with on an individual level with staff, that secondary trauma finds its way into the structure and the culture of the organization. And then we can have organizations that are impacted by trauma. And that can affect the way that protocols, decisions, supervision, all sorts of aspects of the whole operation of an asylum or immigration legal services organization are going. And that can be felt as a really chaotic or frenetic environment to work in. So that's why, you know, I think there's a collective aspect to this too, that we want to be sure to sort of address individual struggles with this, because it will also have contributions to the way, you know, the culture and the feel at the organizations or the places where asylum practitioners are working.
I'll just add to that. I think everything that Eloy and Lyra have said so far, I'm just 100% agreeing with. And there's not the function right now where I can like cheer or clap my hands. So just I'm internally cheering. I would just say that the other piece, I think that in terms of the impact that attorney or service provider burnout and secondary trauma can have on clients is that we know that secondary trauma symptoms mirror PTSD symptoms, right? So some of the avoidance that we see with folks who are suffering from PTSD, I've had PTSD myself, and you know, that avoidance, right? Avoiding the thing that is hard, that can manifest with you as an attorney, and that can seriously undermine ethical obligations in terms of maintaining diligent client contact, communication, following up on work, right? We all can think about that one client who we just dread calling because it's hard and we're avoiding it. And maybe it triggers or brings up something in us. Same with the kind of hyperarousal symptoms that you need to have a PTSD diagnosis, right? Finding yourself on edge. That means we can actually, some of that manifests when we're interacting with human beings, not just at home with our kids or our spouse or others in our lives, but we can have that kind of startle response with clients and the impatience, the irritability that can come with that. So if you're actually struggling with secondary trauma in particular, that's going to play out in the way that you are showing up in every aspect of your life, right? Whether you're sitting in a room with a client or not, but certainly with our clients too.
And kind of pinging off of that, and we'll talk about it when we go through the survey results, but when you're looking at burnout and trauma, I think what's great about these indices is just that they are an index, right? It isn't that it just comes from clients or that it just comes from work. It's a composite score because, as Leora said, people are experiencing this in very individualized ways. I know from my own personal experience, when I worked as an advocate at Tahare, we would have these days where service seekers would call for assistance and you'd be answering the phone. And I would alternate, and I'm just speaking to myself, between feeling very frustrated and angry at the system, feeling there wasn't enough resources, and then feeling very like heartbroken and sad. And you're trying to deal with all that internally while being responsive to phone calls, while working with other clients that are maybe already, you know, officially being represented. And so as you're trying to make sense of this as an individual and how it affects the entire organization and the people calling in for help, I think it does help to have those different pieces and say, well, what it looks like for me may not be how it looks for another person in my organization or for a colleague, because maybe my level of burnout with personal is different than client, is different from work. And indeed, our survey findings show that there are differences across these scales. And similarly, for secondary trauma, as Lindsay mentioned, you have intrusion, avoidance, arousal. Maybe for one person, it's nightmares. Maybe for another, it's being quick-tempered. Maybe for another, it's shutting down. Maybe for somebody, it's all of the above. But I think when we're looking for answers, we often think, well, what does this look like? And there isn't a simple answer. It looks a lot of different things to a lot of different people because of these subscales.
Well, I think that this is a really good point at which we could turn our focus to Professor Mellinger and Professor Harris's research and perhaps get a little bit more background on their findings. You recently published your study on asylum attorney burnout and secondary trauma in the Wake Forest Law Review. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the goals of that research.
So I can kick us off because I lured Hillary into this a little bit later in the game. So, you know, I'll be completely honest. I was drawn to this as someone who's personally affected by it. I practice asylum law. But even more than that, I also am responsible for educating students and training the next generation of attorneys to join us in practicing asylum law and standing alongside these communities. And so I feel a tremendous weight and responsibility to send people out there into a profession that should be sustainable and joyful, and where we can make a difference and where we can truly stand alongside folks in a meaningful way. So I was interested in this as someone who is personally affected by this. I wanted to, you know, I started thinking about this in 2019, 2018, kind of as the Trump administration was going on. I'm seeing Bill in the chat saying he'd done this work since the 80s, and there's been something different about doing it from 2016 to 2020. And I wanted to particularly focus on asylum attorneys because of the 4 years of sustained attacks and efforts to dismantle our asylum system, our system of protection. If you think about it, we had everything from metering, turnbacks at the border, to family separation, zero tolerance, asylum bans, 1.0, 2.0, the transit ban, right? Migrant protection protocols, still have those today, remain in Mexico. Attorney general decisions across the board, some very well known, some still in existence, not as well known, to try and undermine protection for asylum seekers, particularly for people fleeing gang and gender related violence. We had the asylum cooperative agreements, sending people to other countries. We had new fees introduced for asylum seekers. We had new rules to make it more difficult to get work authorization, to make it more challenging for people as they navigate the asylum process. We had the pedantic rejections of asylum applications across the board, right, for failing to write none in a box or to list the location of your deceased relative. Title 42, COVID ban at the border, right? And numerous sets of proposed regulations, I think like 19 or more, one after the other. And so I felt like I wanted to explore how attorneys were doing, and also, frankly, in terms of the goals for this research, which is what you asked, to provide some data to support, frankly, what all of us here probably knew anecdotally and felt ourselves and had a sense of, that attorneys doing this work and others doing this work are struggling with burnout, with trauma exposure, with secondary trauma and other phenomena, associated phenomena. So that was the goal. The goal was to give us some data. The goal was to get this data out there, to substantiate what some of us are saying and feeling, to try and create and normalize a community where we can talk about how it actually feels and the emotional realities of lawyering. And also to give some data to funders and people who are thinking about, how do we manage cases? How many cases should we assign to this brand new attorney or fellow joining our staff? So lots of reasons and kind of goals that I had in launching this survey.
So you mentioned the survey, and I can't imagine it was easy to collect all of that data, but could you tell us a little bit about how you go about crafting a survey to collect that kind of data?
Well, that actually wasn't too hard, mostly because I had the amazing support of Dr. Stuart Lustig, who had done a previous study of immigration judges that was published back in 2007, 2008. And so that's why we chose the scales we use to have attorneys respond to: the Copenhagen Burnout Inventory and the Secondary Traumatic Stress Scale. I wanted to have the same measures so that we could maybe draw some, comparisons between different populations surveyed. So coming up with the survey wasn't that hard, because there's basically standard questions that you ask. Those are tools used to measure self-reported symptoms of burnout and secondary trauma. And then I also really wanted an open-ended question to try and capture whatever attorneys were thinking and wanted to share. And around 321 people wrote those open-ended responses, and those are just rich. There's so much in there that you could unpack. And then also designing the survey, I wanted to see whether there were correlations or kind of any conclusions we could draw or indications we could see about various attorney characteristics, right? From age, race, gender, gender identity, where they practice, like the jurisdiction, circuit courts, what kind of office they practiced in, so they're practitioners, small, medium, large firms, academia, nonprofits, the support staff that they had, the volume of cases that they handled, and then kind of their hours that they worked per week. And then it actually wasn't difficult to get survey responses, I think partially because everybody was really feeling this at the time, right? This was 2020. Half of the responses were pre-COVID, half of them were kind of post-lockdown. That's just how it worked out. But we just pushed out the survey through listservs, Facebook groups, personal contacts, professional networks. Ayla helped with that. So we did get 718 attorneys complete and respond to the survey, which is actually the biggest, apparently, survey of attorney mental health just overall that has been done, which was shocking to me.
Wow, that is fabulous. And what I think we're all wondering, what was the what were the findings of the survey?
Yeah, so I can jump in here. And before I share my screen, I just wanted to kind of echo what Lindsay was saying about these indices. So surveys are sort of a double-edged sword from like a social science / quantitative data analysis perspective, because you have to figure out, are you asking people a question in a way that is standardized, that people are understanding and interpreting it correctly? And so what was really wonderful about, using these indices was that they'd been tested in different ways, which meant, not to get too much into the statistics, but people had said like, okay, essentially, are people understanding this question? Is this a reliable and valid measure? And the answer was yes. So it wasn't like we were reinventing the wheel, right? This was a good standard to use. So I'll go ahead and just quickly share a few quick findings. And all right, so this is very brief, but as Lindsay mentioned, there are a lot of characteristics, and in quantitative methods, we would call these variables. And on the left-hand side, these are just characteristics of the people who took our survey. So we asked things about their age, their gender identity. They gave the option to share their race and their ethnicity. And these are two different terms, but here we put them together for a very specific reason, and that is because the bar is predominantly still white individuals. That means that survey respondents of other races and ethnicities, if we had split up these categories, it would have been smaller numbers, which would have potentially made people identifiable. And we wanted to keep everything anonymous. We also looked at how large their office was. So, and their type of office. So whether you're a solo practitioner, whether it was a firm, a nonprofit, an academic institution, the number of paralegals or support staff, the jurisdiction, which here was operationalized as the circuit court, the number of hours they worked a week, and again, whether they took this pre-pandemic, which for us was before March 15th. Sorry, this should be March 15th for both, or after March 15th. And then over here, dependent variables is just what you asked, Dina, like what is the outcome? What are people saying in terms of burnout and secondary traumatic stress? And these indices have these subcategories, right? Personal, work, client. And the way it works is you would essentially add these up and divide them, get an average, and that average would be your overall burnout score. But you could also have an individual average for personal burnout or work burnout or client burnout. And the same is true for secondary trauma, looking at intrusion, avoidance, or arousal. So just to show you, mean here just means average. So looking at an average score, burnout, the scale for burnout, if you were to have an actual, if you were to do this survey right now, everybody attending this webinar, the scale for burnout goes from 0 to 100. So the closer your average score is to 100, the more symptoms that you are self-reporting for burnout. So people's overall scores were 58.15. 50 is the midpoint of 0 to 100. So that's just saying people are more towards that very high level of burnout, and they're self-reporting it. And if you look down at these subscales, you can see most of it's coming personally or from work. Clients are actually the lowest, which I think is very insightful, and it's something that we talk about in our article. Secondary trauma, the scale is very different. So it's coded from 0 to 5, so not a 100-point scale. And 2.95 was people's overall average score, which means, again, leaning closer towards 5. And you're seeing here arousal is kind of where they're scoring the highest. Then there's something called, this is a table that I can go back to. M stands for mean. And if you're looking, it just shows personal, work, client, overall intrusion, just going straight down. And that M is the average. Standard deviation just shows how spread out it is. So of all the different people who took it, they're not all going to be 65.12. Some will be 17 points higher. That's what the standard deviation is showing, or 17 points lower. So there's a decent amount of spread. And very quickly, there's something called regressions, which some of you may be familiar with. But for those of you who aren't familiar with regressions, essentially a regression is trying to say, if we're looking at all of these characteristics, which ones of them are going to be associated with higher or lower levels of self-reported burnout? And the ones that really stood out to us that I'll focus on here are gender, race, and weekly hours worked. So for burnout, gender and race were the biggest things that caught our attention. And whenever you do a regression, I should note that just according to quantitative methods, regressions always compare against another group. And for us, the group here was, we were comparing against men. So the reason for that is essentially people who identified as female or as other, their stress was higher than people who identified as male. So in reference to males, these other categories of gender identity were associated or predictive of higher levels of self-reported burnout or stress. Specifically, that 6.86 what this is saying in quantitative methods speak is if you created a hypothetical person and you didn't know anything about that hypothetical person other than that their gender identity was female, that characteristic, just that one characteristic, is predicted to increase their burnout by 6.86. And you can imagine as you add on other characteristics, like let's say that you add on that they identified their race as being from Middle East or North Africa, now you're increasing it by another 11.79 points compared to white racial categories. So that's what a regression does, which is really cool from a statistical perspective, is you can almost add up these different identity characteristics and say, supposing you had somebody who identified as female, who was of this racial category, who worked in a nonprofit, as we add these things up, what can we predict their burnout or secondary trauma might be? For secondary trauma, race didn't come up there, gender did. Weekly hours worked was the other one that came up. But beyond that, and here I just wanted to show you, this is, I know it probably strikes confusion in everybody in the audience, but I did want to share the actual statistical table with you as a good social scientist. This is what a coefficient table would look like. Don't be shocked. Remember, the burnout scale is 0 to 100. So if you're looking at this, it's saying, look at age. Do you see that minus 3.09? That's just saying the older you get, the less your burnout is predicted to be, holding all these other characteristics constant. So just think of it as adding and subtracting. That's a little bit oversimplified, but it gets you the main idea. But some other things that you could point out as well are, I'll just go back up to this table for a second, just to very quickly run through it. For those of you in the audience who are solo practitioners, congratulations, you guys are more stressed than everybody else. So the survey predicted that, so essentially all other workplaces were associated with fewer symptoms of burnout and secondary traumatic stress compared to the reference group of solo practitioners. In terms of support staff, unsurprisingly, the more support staff that people had, the less symptoms of burnout and secondary trauma they reported. The more asylum cases they had, the more symptoms of burnout and secondary stress. The same is true for weekly hours worked. Circuit courts, it's a little bit more complicated. There weren't quite as many clear-cut answers. And if we have time to get into it, I know that Lindsay had some great ideas for why that was the case. But the very short answer is that there are some immigration courts that may be more or less friendly and jurisdictions that may be more or less friendly. So jurisdiction isn't a proxy for the specific immigration court or asylum office in which somebody would be practicing. Age, older respondents were associated with less burnout and secondary traumatic stress. But again, I know I'm running short on time, but as Lindsay can explain, there's something that is important called survivor bias, which is the people who are taking this survey, they may be the survivors. They may be older, but they're also the ones still in the profession. People who are very burnt out or having secondary trauma or other symptoms, they may have said we need to leave this profession. And so then they wouldn't take the survey and then we wouldn't have their responses. And finally, the respondents who took the survey after March 15th were associated with lower levels of burnout and secondary trauma. It's hard to explain exactly why this is the case other than a lot of things were happening around March 15th, 2020. And so that is sort of more of a fun thought experiment for why that's the case. And the last thing I'll say is there are a lot of limitations. So this is a really amazing survey, but there are omitted variables. And by that, just omitted characteristics, right? There's only so much you can put into a survey. You can't generalize it to the entire legal profession. That's what external validity refers to in quantitative speak. We can say that we're doing our best to represent the views of the people who took the survey, but we're not going to say this is going to be true for the entire legal profession. So I know I just ran over that very quickly. I hope it somewhat made sense, and I want to make sure the other panelists can speak, but that's a quick snapshot of the findings.
Larry, that's so helpful, because I want to echo with what one of our audience members said. It's so important to kind of see that the data backs up what a lot of us have been feeling and what a lot of us have observed, and also to see what it really translates to in terms of who's really being affected within the subset of our profession. And now I think we've gotten a good idea of the realities on the ground. I'd like to move on to a topic that not too many people spend time discussing when evaluating the crises that impact our profession, and that's what we can what we can really do about it. And I imagine there is some kind of like tried and true advice, but I'd like to hear both on the kind of micro scale and the macro scale of what it is we can do to mitigate some of these struggles. So on a more basic level, if a practitioner is struggling with burnout or secondary trauma, what are some of the available tools that they can employ to mitigate some of these symptoms?
Kind of on a broad strokes level, and I would also be curious to hear from the other folks here about what has worked for them in particular. But we often talk about really the need for a multifaceted approach. And so that to mitigate, to prevent, or to respond to secondary trauma and burnout, that means not just your own individual self-care and coping skills, but it also has to do with your peer-to-peer relationships, supervision, the structure of and response of the organization. I think one of the things that was interesting that was talked about, or that you highlighted, Hillary, is that, of those things that impacted burnout, that one of the least predictive indicators was the client work, which I think this is really interesting because often where we start the conversation is like, oh, well, secondary trauma comes from being exposed to our clients' stories. But when we dig in just a little bit deeper, that's often something that we learn how to deal with over time. And it's some of these bigger institutional and societal level issues that are more impactful in the long term to somebody's sustainable career in the field, right? And that's these policy changes, feeling like you're working in an unjust environment, aren't able to affect change. When MPP, the grant rates of MPP were as low as less than 1% in some areas of getting into the United States or having an asylum claim granted, that took a toll on the profession in a way that's really different than collecting a story from an affidavit. So I think what that points to in terms of talking about response is that, yes, it's really essential and important to have a good self-care plan that is not an emergency response plan. It's not something you just activate when you're feeling the secondary trauma, but it comes with routines and rituals that allow you to be more sustained and practiced over time. But perhaps more important than that is having an institutional response. So that can come from within an institution like the ABA or from our individual legal services organizations, law firms that are engaging in pro bono practice, but there have to be comprehensive supports that look at caseload, look at HR benefits, make sure that medical insurance includes behavioral health, that we're talking about supervision structure, that there's access to peer consultation so you're not in isolation in dealing with these cases and these stories. It has to come from all levels and all parts of what it means to operate in this environment. And we don't want to put the burden or the blame just back on an individual and say, well, if you're experiencing secondary trauma, then you must not be doing enough yoga. There's no way to yoga your way out of Trump era immigration policies, the ACA, the MPP that Lindsay talked about. No amount of meditation will take that away. We need institutional responses, and we also need policy change. So this has to come from all levels. So I'm off my soapbox for now.
No, that's really important. I hope we're going to talk about some of those broader remedies that we can think about. Are there, I know we heard a little bit earlier that the solo practitioner is particularly impacted here. And I wonder, are there on an individual basis, and we're going to move to the broader ones soon, are there recommendations for people who are by nature more isolated in their practice?
Absolutely. One of the things that we talk about a lot is the need for peer-to-peer support networks. And so, that resilience at its core is relationships. And so the more that you feel connected into community of practice and feel supported by others doing similar work, that's something that can help to mitigate burnout and secondary trauma as well. So for solo practitioners, what we often recommend is to plug into a bigger community of practice. And that might look different for different people and who's involved in that, to be sure that you have access to other folks who are doing similar or related work, where you can access consultation, support, just somebody to debrief with every once in a while. But it's really important to try to take steps to mitigate that isolation.
Similarly, before we move on to kind of those broader steps, when we're talking peer to peer, say you're a practitioner in the immigration bar, and specifically within the asylum practicing immigration bar, and that's usually a small and close-knit community. Is there something that a practitioner can do if they identify another peer who appears to be impacted? And that might be a complex question. How can we lend a hand to one another on an individual basis?
I think my delay in responding to that, and maybe others, is that I think it would just be an individual response. My response to an individual is going to depend who that individual is, how well I know them, what my relationship is, what any power dynamics at play might be, what other like differences between us might be, what we share. So I don't think there is kind of one cookie cutter response to this. I think the most important thing is just to reach out, right? And to make a connection and let that person know that you see them and that you're there for them. And I think that one thing I think about us as individuals is that we all have a responsibility to shape the culture of our workplaces and of our professions. So, we can ask AILA to have a well-being center, which they do, and to set up, support and mentoring and groups for solo practitioners, which they should do. But we can find ways to change cultures, right? So one way to cultivate resilience in this work is to actually take time to celebrate the wins, right? The small wins. So many of us don't do that. And that's also a sign of burnout, secondary trauma. But how often do you actually take a moment to celebrate when your client's work permit is approved, right? That's actually kind of a victory these days sometimes, or it certainly was under Trump and still is now, I think. But finding ways to visually, to in a feeling way, using your senses to celebrate the small wins, I think is so important to cultures, to workplaces, and to making this sustainable, along with policies around, work-life balance and leave and actually taking vacation time. And Bill asked in the Q&A, what can we do as supervisors, as managers? I think one of the things is absolutely modeling, right? If you've been in this for a while and you're in a position of power or influence, or you're teaching or you're supervising, you need to model that yourself, right? You need to have your boundaries. You need to take your time off. You need to, along with wonderful things like sabbaticals or, real personal time off and caregiving leave, flexible policies, personal time, that all needs to happen. But as individuals, there's so much we can do just by the way that we show up and the way that we are vulnerable sometimes.
Thank you.
I think that it is such a great privilege to be able to do the work that we do and to advocate on behalf of others. And I think it's telling that we have such a robust and diverse group of people that have entered this profession. And because of that, I think everyone is motivated to do this work in different ways. So I think it's always important for us to understand what our role is and what our role isn't. And that's very much dictated by kind of what we have to do as practitioners to serve our clients. I think Lindsay and Hillary, y'all did a great job of kind of outlining in your paper what our role is and what may contribute to some of that burnout. And you had a line in there that says an asylum seeker must in some ways demonstrate their own powerlessness and lack of agency. So from one hand, we're trying to empower our clients to tell their story, to be put in a position to tell their story. But at the same time, we're being asked to almost disempower them or to highlight their disempowerment in this entire system. So, and that's particularly tough because for me, I have a deep-seated cultural obligation to help. So our clients who may come from very similar cultural backgrounds may have an expectation of me. And that expectation of me is hard to reconcile with all these other factors that, we have to, go through in order to have success. So I'm glad that your paper actually gives the open idea for, or the possibility of future research on how kind of, race, ethnicity may contribute or that relationship. So I think something that I would be willing to be a part of if, and I'm not trying to force you to take on another project because I know y'all just took this on, but that sounds, something that's great and glad to be a part of this.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly ping pong off of that and say a couple of things. One is, Eloy, I think one of my biggest frustrations working with survivors is that they're survivors and almost everything in immigration law, right? It's show that you're a victim, show that you meet these criteria. And it's like you're trying to reinforce to this person how incredibly strong and brave and resourceful they are while you're working on these declarations and forms that seem to tear all of that down. So 100%. I also just wanted to thank Lindsay when somebody was asking the question, you know, what can we do as individuals? How would you help that person? So just my personal history was I started at Tahare maybe 2 years out of undergrad when Lindsay was an attorney there. And I had the privilege of working with her for several years, and she mentored me. And you can't see because I have obviously a beautiful cherry blossom fake background, but there's a bookshelf behind me. And my very first week at Tahare, I was so eager to learn. And Lindsay gave me some of her law journal articles, which I still have, and they're highlighted. And it was such an honor when she brought me into this project that was, you know, her passion. And she brought that passion to Tahare. So within our workplace, she brought these conversations up. Whenever I was answering phone calls, she and other people, you know, would come by and be like, what do you need? Do you need a soda? Do you want to take a walk around the building for 15 minutes? Do you need to take a break? Introducing things like coloring books. We had weekly staff meetings where we would congratulate each other on the small wins. But it's because of, you know, people like Lindsay and an organization saying, let's talk about this, right? Talking is the first start and recognizing it. And now to be privileged enough to be brought onto this project with her. And Eloy, Lindsay has so many ideas. I mean, she wrote, you know, huge sections of those paper. I did the findings and the stats, but she was the impetus and the backbone throughout the entire thing. And there are so many areas where somebody could take, for example, in quantitative methods, you could take somebody's race and gender and you could interact them and see what that would look like. The reason we didn't was because, again, we had very small numbers of respondents for certain racial categories, and you can't have a few people speak for everyone else. So quantitatively speaking, it would have been very skewed if we had done that. But it would be so wonderful to be able to do future studies where, to your point, Elo, right? What does it mean to represent clients who maybe identify with you? What does that work look like? How is that different for somebody like me, you know, with prior work experience? And I think there's a lot of scope to kind of build this out and go in different directions.
Thank you so much, all of you. That's really quite informative. And I think that something I really want to circle back on is this idea of a system that by nature requires our clients to demonstrate a lack of agency, and a profession that theoretically should give agency to its clients. And that brings me kind of to this idea of what are the kind of systemic and policy changes that we can take on broadly to help mitigate, you know, this crisis? What would you like to see?
What a beautiful question. I mean, I think it's funny, like the further I get in this work, when I've developed more relationships with folks or supporting them and creating their own plans, we'll often get to a point where they'll say, my self-care plan is comprehensive immigration reform, right? Like that's what it would look like to be able to do the work in the way that I want to. But to be a little bit more specific, I mean, I think we've talked a lot about what would it mean to have a more trauma-informed asylum system, to kind of bring together our professions, not just the legal, but also the background that I come from, social work, mental health, to get a lot of different folks together at the table, center the experiences and the voices of communities of asylum seekers, and to ask about their experiences in the immigration system, the asylum system, and understand, you know, what would have been different or more supportive or validating to their experience, and to really think about what does it mean to have a less adversarial system and one that is more supportive and acknowledging of the things that folks have gone through, and sets the tone for what the rest of their experience as they move through the system and establish themselves in the United States, like what that would look like. And we've talked about everything from eliminating immigration detention to let's say, you know, assigning a caseworker to all of the cases. Anybody who's an asylum seeker who's gone through a credible fear interview is entitled to a support person and somebody who helps them to navigate through not just their asylum case, but what it means to kind of orient to the life in the United States. We've talked about the opportunities to build in this type of secondary trauma training, support services into USCIS. I know somebody earlier talked a little bit about what supports are available for some of our, asylum officers or members of the government. That also impacts them, right? The folks who are adjudicating the asylum claims need to have this type of support as well. So, I mean, we could look at a lot of different aspects of what it means to reform the system to make it kind of more embedded deeply in the understanding of the impact of trauma and what it means to be trauma informed.
I think I echo all of that. I wish there was more due process throughout the entire system and more support, period. But in particular, I've been very interested. A lot of my independent research now looks at language access and interpretation, because I think the words we use, the way we speak, and the languages we choose also carries a lot in it. I'm not a native Spanish speaker by any means, but my Spanish is fairly good, and I would accompany individuals either as a paralegal or an interpreter or a BIA rep to asylum interviews where you aren't automatically provided an interpreter in most circumstances. And I remember once it was an unaccompanied individual, and the asylum officer was a Spanish speaker. And because this was a minor, think of the way kids describe stories like he said, she said, and then trying to avoid certain words, right? Because there's a stigma attached to certain forms of persecution. And me trying to interpret on behalf of that individual, I remember thinking, I hope the asylum officer is understanding. And they were nodding and they looked at me and they said, I actually understand everything, this asylum applicant is saying. And I think language carried that, right? Because words have power and they're tied into culture and all of these other things. And you may not want to use words for certain types of trauma or abuse that you've survived. They may be triggering or they may have stigma, and being able to understand not just the language that you prefer to speak and the words that you use, but everything that embodies, I think is also very important for survivors who often feel like they're forced to maybe speak in a different language or use certain words. That was another thought I had.
There's a pretty good abolition conversation going on in the chat, and I think that's really the big question. And that was a struggle for me in writing this paper. Because in a way, I feel like, can you accept the system that we have? Can you tweak something around the margins when it's a system that is not only dysfunctional, but grounded in racism, propped up and built on the foundations of white supremacy? If we're going to have an immigration court system, would I like them to be independent? Do I support Zoe Lofgren's bill? Yes, but at the same time, I have questions about that, because then we're going to give independent, more authority and independence to immigration judges, and many of whom should not be immigration judges, should not be on the bench, should be removed from the bench. We do not want to give them lifetime tenure. We would like them to be fireable. So I think there's so much good thinking around this, and I would encourage everybody to participate in important discussions that are being led on this concept, right? Reformist versus non-reformist reforms, and the work of, Silky Shah and Shireen Shabea and Angelica Chazare, Leila Khlas. Like, so many folks now are thinking about abolition, right? And thinking about completely abolishing the system of immigration enforcement oppression that we have, and starting from zero.
And I know we're running short on time. Lindsay and Hillary, I know you brought up certain measures that you thought systemically as a profession that we could take on in your paper. And I wonder if you could touch very briefly on some of the ways that we could address some of this from within our profession. And Eloy, of course, if you would like to jump in there too, no.
Eloy, do you want to start?
No, please. I didn't catch the entire part of the first question, so I'll.
I mean, I'll just start. I was off in law school, right? If we're thinking about attorneys and how we train attorneys, and even if we're thinking about folks who work with attorneys and within the legal system, I think the way we train attorneys is very important. And as a legal educator, I do, again, feel tremendous responsibility for this, for managing my own burnout, my own trauma exposure, modeling that, but also working towards what I think is a huge culture shift that we need in how we think and talk about lawyering and how we train lawyers. We have little to no professional training, unlike other helping professions. There's no safeguards. Law school remains, traditionally and still now a cutthroat environment. We glorify all-nighters and being busy. Even in social justice circles, there's this concept of martyrdom, of being the white savior coming in, the white knight on a horse, saving our clients. There's a culture of just winning cases, right? That's how we define our success. Admitting vulnerability or weakness is not really accepted. It can be scary and dangerous. And even with admission to the bar, which talking about other systems to abolish, right, the bar exam, admission to the bar, if you admit that you have any mental health concerns, that can be a red flag for you, and it can make your admission to the bar more difficult. So there's so much that we need to do. I do think that law schools need to actively address this and train students to not only think like a lawyer, as I say in the paper, I credit Brittany Stringfellow-Ote with this, but to deal with the emotional realities of being a lawyer, right? Not only to think like a lawyer, but what does it mean to be a lawyer? How do you be a lawyer? And deal with that very human experience. So I think law schools have to actually change their curriculum and require students to think about cases in different ways, as people. just everything needs to be more human around law school and around emotions in law school and in lawyering as a beginning. And then there's a lot we can do kind of post-grad as well.
Yeah, I think this is really great. So my internet was cutting out a little bit. That's why I didn't catch the entire question. But yeah, to your point, I think that's great. I think we are in a position, as having gone through a lot of this, to be able to shape how we create this profession and what directions we want to get, where we want to take it. So none of this should be taken to dissuade. If there are some young attorneys in the audience, nobody should be dissuaded from joining our profession, because we need you. We need all the hands we can get, but we need people who are aware, and hopefully we can, as practitioners, can help and guide in that and continue these conversations, because they're very important. And I wish I had this 10 years ago when I started, but we live and learn.
I want to thank everybody for attending today's panel, and I want to thank our panelists and our experts. I've learned a great deal, and I'm sure our audience has as well. And as Eloy has brought up, today's conversation is only the beginning, and I hope that we'll continue these conversations within our profession and within our circles, and to look out for one another and seek some of those systemic changes that may serve us all as practitioners. Thank you again, everybody. Take care.